Hello, welcome back to my seminar on the rhetoric of death. This is part 2. And today I'm going to be talking about 2 studies that I completed, one in Northern Appalachia and one in Central Appalachia, sort of to give you an idea of how gravestones can be used to look at the way that people are depicted in death and how that is a snapshot of the way that we're depicted in life. So just to go back and review a little bit what I talked about at the end of the first session. We were talking about the gravestone as a rhetorical artifact, and you can see here some photographs that I've taken of different cemeteries in Northern and Central Appalachia, and actually this is a New England gravestone, I believe in Boston. I love gravestones. I think cemeteries, I look at them like museums. And when you think about them that way, think about all of the ways that the cemetery is a cultural landscape, particularly for a community. And therein, we find lots of rhetorical messages embedded. It's called a cultural landscape because it's a reflection of change over time. It's like a community's timeline or a city's timeline. War, disease, religion, familial relationships, industry, shifting social attitudes are all illustrated in gravestones, and those endure century after century. So it's a premier site for field work, particularly if you're teaching qualitative methods or rhetorical study or critical study, because it uncovers changes regarding attitudes about death over time. And so I wrote a little paragraph in a paper that I want to read to you because I can't say it as well, I think, as I wrote it, but it really captures why I do this kind of work. American mainstream society appears to be moving toward standardization and less toward distinction. Small towns in Appalachia, for example, are at risk of withering as economies once dependent upon coal become weaker. Hollow, family-owned stores sit in the shadows of strip malls and superstores. As pieces of small-town culture are erased, the cemetery remains a museum that quietly grows larger, where rhetorical messages and connections to ancestors are represented in its architecture, epitaphs, and iconography. So one pattern that we see suggests stratifications of power. Class distinction is evident in the type of monument or gravestone that a family could afford and where it's placed in the cemetery as well. The bigger, more expensive types of stones suggest wealth and status. More money could also buy plots in the cemetery, the center of the cemetery, where gravestones are easily seen and accessed. Epitaphs and iconography may tell you more about how the deceased became affluent in the community. When I do this type of work, I interpret the messages through a critical lens, because that lens shows us that the readers of death would have been those with the most power or the most agency in how people were represented. So primarily white men and the wealthy, when we're talking about very early depictions of death. As beliefs about gender become embedded within a community's architecture and landscape, that communicates how different members of the community relate to each other. And then this assumption brings us to the focus of the studies that I do. This particular study, how men and women have been linguistically and visually represented in death over the past couple of centuries. So that's what we're talking about today, is gendered depictions of death. So looking through a critical lens, looking at rhetorical messages and how they're embedded in the landscape and the architecture of gravestones, and what that tells us about how beliefs have changed over time and how those beliefs are challenged or sustained in rhetorical messaging. Very little has been published about this, so there's not a lot of reading to do in terms of gendered depictions of death in gravestones, but it remains, I think, a fascinating topic that I'm excited to share with you. So if we think about how men have historically controlled public forms of literacy, and that the funeral industry has always generally been governed by men. Stone cutters who carved gravestones for centuries were likely to have been men. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that even in death, men and women are represented in a hierarchical manner or patriarchal manner, that women are memorialized based on their domestic roles, not necessarily as independent selves. We're talking about in the earliest forms of gravestone rhetoric. So let me go back to context. We were talking about context as a framework for studying rhetoric and how important it is. I always begin there with my students. Anytime they choose a rhetorical message to analyze, we start with the context of that message. It's important to understand the who, what, when, where, and why, because that frames the encoding of that message. It also frames the decoding of that message. So we learn as much as we can about the place and time in which the message is situated. So as I talked about before, the two areas that I've studied are Northern Appalachia, just outside of Pittsburgh, in a township called Indiana, Pennsylvania, and Central Appalachia in the coal fields of Wise County, Virginia. And so I talked last time about the demographics of the region. It's 900 miles long. It's quite diverse because of the history of immigrants working in the extraction industries. And then we talked about the earliest forms of gravestones. We talked about how cemeteries grew. So I chose these particular cemeteries based on characteristics of an effective research site as outlined by Vitudis and Lowe. They have documented histories. They represent broad spans of time during which change may be documented, and they're both manageable size for analysis. So when I take my students into the Wise County Cemetery that I've studied, that's an important thing to note, is that you start in the oldest, there's an old section, and then it's sort of a timeline. You move through time as you're analyzing the stones. It's a great place in the field to see trends playing out right before your eyes, trends and patterns. And so when we're teaching about rhetorical strategy, patterns, that's one of the things we look for. Patterns, frequency, and how syntactics and semantics work together to create that message. So when we collect data at the site, the data comes primarily from stones, and while the rows may not always be uniform, you can map a kind of grid that allows you to record data. What I teach my students to do is to walk each row left to right. We use our cell phones, we use cameras, we do video recording. We have charts where we count. A lot of counting takes place in cemeteries. We record on that chart names, dates of birth and death, epitaph, and iconography. That can be put together with archives, documents from archives. So I often follow up by going to the community courthouse, and one of the things that I've done is analyzed how death was recorded institutionally. How were women discussed? How were men discussed? And how has that changed over time as well? So that's another layer of data that you can place with the gravestone architecture that gives you more information. So in the Northern Appalachian site, some more context about this particular cemetery. It's in the historic center of town. A railroad runs perpendicular to the eastern side of the cemetery. There was a strip mall and a highway located to the southwest. The classic architecture and mossy stones of the oldest section are just next to an automotive shop and a pizza restaurant. So it's like 2 centuries of development collide in this space, and it's hard to understand where one belongs in the context of the other. But this particular cemetery was founded in 1864 in response to the numbers of Civil War casualties. So in this particular site, I analyzed almost 500 stones. I looked at mortality patterns. I looked at names and how they were depicted. And so you can see in this photograph here an example of what I was talking about with the hierarchy, the hierarchical relationship between stones. So when we think about semantics and syntactics, if you'll look here, this is the stone of a wife and the stone of her husband. And if we think about hegemonic beliefs, about 19th century hegemonic beliefs, particularly in early 20th century, about the traditional household and the traditional family, man as head of the household, woman as his helper and subordinate, you can see that represented in the architecture of these stones. One is smaller than the other, one is placed beside the other. So a little bit more about the context of this particular cemetery. The mean age of death in the 19th century for men was 47, and the mean age for women was 46, fairly young. Men frequently died from work-related accidents like mine roof falls, explosions, railroad accidents. So this is a coal mining community as well. Women frequently died from childbirth or the illnesses that their children contracted. Most frequently mentioned in death records are whooping cough and diphtheria. So you can see that as I counted, this is how many stones belonging to men, stones belonging to women, stones belonging to children, and you can see that this drops off dramatically in the 20th century. Look at this pattern. This is really interesting. So this is one of the things that I look for. When you see older stones, you typically see individualized stones for men with first and last names, and then his wife may have her name on the stone, but it usually it says wife of, and his name is placed on her stone again. So you rarely see in the older stones, you rarely see the man and woman's name together on one stone. And this may have been a product of more industrialized gravestone cutting later on, but I found no evidence of that between 1790 and 1899, but I counted 100 after the year 1900, 100 of those. So that was interesting. Entire family represented on one stone, 0 in this time period, 11 in this time period. So we see sort of a trend in how families are choosing to be depicted, how husbands and wives are choosing to be depicted. Familial representation and occupation is also interesting. So when we look at the semantics, when we look in particular at the lexical items, so the discursive symbols or the text on the stone, this is really interesting. So again, looking through a critical lens and thinking about how women are depicted, the epitaph and the iconography of these stones suggest a predominantly Protestant population in this particular community. So Protestant faith supports hierarchical structure in the chain of being: God, man, woman, children, beast. So if you think about biblical text, Ephesians 5:23 admonishes wives to submit to their husbands. since the husband is the head of the wife. I'm quoting, head of the wife as also Christ is the head of the church. And many Protestant Christians believed, as stated in Proverbs, that he who finds a good wife obtains favor from the Lord. So this doctrine may be a possible explanation of why the descriptor wife of appears more frequently than husband of on gravestones. It also explains why women are identified in death within the context of familial roles such as true wife, faithful mother, etc. So look at these percentages. Between 1790 and 1899, wife occurs far more frequently than husband on gravestones. Women are characterized as wives, in other words. Men are not characterized as husbands. This goes down dramatically in the 20th century, again reflecting a shift in social attitudes, perhaps. Mother appears 14% of the time. It jumps to 49% in the 20th century. Father appears 9% of the time and jumps to 26%. Epitaph and iconography includes images that are etched into the stones. Let me say one more thing too about the frequency with which women are described in their familial roles. It suggests that the role of caregiver, so if we go back and we think about why mother is such a prominent inscription on a stone, the role of caregiver is dominant in the lexica of death. So if we think about Deborah Tannen's work in linguistics, it could, these could be double meaning words. It could signal both power and solidarity. So instead of seeing women as powerless, this one way of seeing this is as a term of reverence. I hope I'm making sense. I think I'm sort of getting there to the point, but a term of reverence rather than a term of subordination. Mother is a revered term in Western culture, and we have holidays built around mothers and holidays built around fathers, and so that could be one possible reason why you see that more frequently. I'm jumping between two screens here, which is why I sound disjointed. Women are more frequently identified as daughter and sister, as are men identified as brother and son. So men are more frequently identified by their occupations than women. So in this corpus of 19th century stones, there are of course, no women are identified by occupation because they did not work outside the home, rarely worked outside the home. But I did find instances of 3 men identified with the title Reverend and 2 identified with the titles Doctor and MD. Of the 20th century stones, 49% identify men according to their military service. And I did find several instances of women being identified by occupation in the 20th century stones. Okay, so epitaphs or longer gravestone inscriptions appear more frequently in the 19th century than they do in the 20th century. So they contain a complicated formula of rhythm meter and other literary devices, almost like prayers. Poetic verses were common during the Victorian period, but by the 20th century, you see fewer instances of discursive symbols. It may say something like loving mother or only sleeping. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, when illnesses were carrying away the elderly women and children with frequency, death is almost always metaphorically referred to as sleep or rest. And you can see examples of that here. There are also references to everlasting life and resurrection. So death is a means to achieve a heavenly goal in these particular messages, which made the inevitability of death maybe less frightening for people, especially when it was occurring so frequently. It's a way of processing that grief and that inevitability of your mortality. The epitaphs of women tend to be longer. They tend to be more poetic. And there are linguistic differences that we find. So women in 1899 were often referred to as servant, gentle, but men might be referred to as just, or I'm trying to think of another example. Just is the best example I can come up with right now, but that's a very different characterization. Just is a very different characterization from servant. So after 1850, life expectancy increased and epitaphs trended toward a separate, less familiar relationship with death. So people had more choices because of technology. And you can see that influence on gravestones from later periods. So in part 3 of this seminar, I will be talking about the Central Appalachian site and comparing it to the Northern Appalachian site in the same traits and characteristics that we talked about here.